What is going on, gunfighters? Saddle up for a cool cartridge talk today on Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns and gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I am your host, Michael Milito. I am humbled and blessed to be able to serve you today. First and foremost, I'm a Christian. I've also been blessed by God to be a professional gunfighter most of my adult life. If you want a more thorough bio, you can probably find it on many of the other episodes. Now let's get into the day's topic. The 380 ACP, automatic Colt pistol. Known as the 9 Kurtz, 9 short, or 9x17. You see, right around the same time we got a couple of other great cartridges, the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, we got the 45 ACP, we got the 9mm Luger, and we got the 380 ACP. Now, per Wikipedia, to give credit where credit is due, if this is correct, 1908. Also designed, like many other great American firearms inventions of that time, by John Moses Browning. Pretty cool that it was first introduced, I believe, by the Colt Company for the 1908 Pocket Hammerless, and marketed as a self-defense handgun. How about that? It's still commonly marketed as a go-to self-defense handgun. So you gotta give credit there. I mean, it came out in 1908 as a good defensive handgun option, and it's still today, I think, one of the top calibers for defensive handgun options. That's kind of remarkable. I don't think it is a stretch at all to say that John Moses Browning was a firearms genius. That's how you kind of know that a cartridge is great. It's still being used for what it was intended for, like the 45 ACP, the 9mm Luger, the 22 long rifle, and the 380. They just can't be usurped. It was developed as kind of a personal defense, small handgun, compact handgun round, and it still shines in that role today. Now, the nomenclature may confuse some people. .380, that's not the actual caliber. It is in fact .355 caliber, the same caliber as 9mm. Caliber is not the cartridge. Cartridge is a cartridge. Caliber is just a measurement of the bullet in inches. The diameter of the bullet, that's caliber, a measurement in inches. 50 caliber, .50 is half an inch. 25 caliber, .25 is 1/4 of an inch. .355 of an inch. That's what caliber 380 is, not 38 caliber. I know that's kind of confusing if you're not in the know, but it's very common for cartridges to be named something that is not their caliber. The 380 is such. Much like the 9mm, this is also 9mm if you measure it by the metric standard. However, instead of a 19mm case, the 9x19, we commonly call the 9mm, this is a 9x17. Hence the name it got, the 9 Kurtz, or 9 short. And we think of this as kind of a very small gun caliber today, but historically it was used a lot. Military and police roles, especially in Europe. And many, many popular handguns throughout the years have been chambered in 380. One really cool historic example we talked about, the Pocket Hammerless. By today's standards, fairly large for a 380 ACP, but for the time, a pretty compact gun with quite a bit of firepower compared to what was available in 1908. Also, kind of legendary, the Walther PK and PPK, the James Bond gun. Not the only caliber, but commonly chambered in 380. And there's a lot of cool, kind of esoteric military handguns in the early and turn of the 20th century chambered in .380. I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list of all of those. That would be quite boring. But there have been some very notable handguns in .380. And you might be thinking, that's great, but I'm probably not putting a pocket hammerless 1908 in a Kydex holster and rocking an appendix or taking it to a shooting class. What's the point for today? Well, thankfully there have been a lot of more modern guns chambered in the .380. The Keltec P380, the Car 380s, the Ruger LCP, which was kind of that, and the Smith & Wesson Bodyguard. Both were kind of game changers in a super subcompact, very tiny, pocket size carry, .380. Again, if you look at a Smith & Wesson Bodyguard or a Ruger LCP, and I forget which one came first, but they were kind of popular at the same time. You look at the size of that versus a Walther PPK or a 1908, right? Really small. I know the Colt Mustang came out before that, but it was never super popular that I can remember. Maybe that was a little bit before my time. But the ability to have that kind of firepower in such a small, handy package, when I was a police officer, when I was an instructor for police officers, when those came on the market, they became a common police backup handgun. They're tiny. They can fit in a handcuff case. And you're not talking about a .22 Derringer, right? You're talking about a semi-automatic .380 ACP. Those guns that were mentioned are pretty good guns. Now you got things like the Ruger LCP Max. You got things like the Smith & Wesson EZ. And the Glock 42, the babiest of the baby Glocks in .380. And that's why I think it's still relevant today. I'm going to be honest with you. Unless you count my wife's .380, I don't own a .380. I've never owned a .380. I generally carry a full-size fighting handgun. And when I pocket carry an ultralight small gun, I carry a Smith & Wesson 360 and 357 Magnum. However, I see why they are still so popular. For a lot of people that aren't willing or aren't able to carry a larger gun. The .380 ACP gives you the ability to have a semi-automatic, repeatable firepower handgun. I mean, it can fit in a back pocket, and that's better than having no gun. And you could say just, carry a bigger gun, which again I normally do. But like my wife, when we went shopping for her, I wanted a gun that she could take when she goes hiking, that she could take when she goes running on a trail, riding a bike. By God's grace, my wife's very active. And there's just a limit. If it's too big and too heavy, she's just not going to carry it. And we went and shot several different things, tried several different things, and she settled on, wouldn't have been my choice, but she settled on the Glock 42. And I'd much rather her have a Glock 42 than nothing. And I think that's why the .380 is still relevant. It lets you have a gun and a decent amount of firepower, a decent amount of capacity when you otherwise wouldn't have a gun. And here's the deal, I'm going to be honest. For me, if I'm getting a gun that size, I'm probably just going to go a little bit bigger and get it in a 9mm. Right? Instead of a Ruger LCP, get a Ruger LC9. Instead of a Glock 42, get a Glock 43. But there are some people where that is above the threshold. Right? It just is for them. Like my wife, that was the biggest she was willing to carry. And she runs. And I don't mean like she jogs around the block. Like she runs. She runs marathons. She recently did a half marathon. Like she's a runner. And for her, again, I'd much rather her have a super subcompact .380 than no gun. And that is why the primary reason I believe the .380 is still so prolific in the defensive handgun world today. Is it because it's the best defensive caliber? No. Is it because it's super potent? A great, one-shot stopper? No. It's because it allows a lot of people to have a gun when they otherwise wouldn't have a gun. Since we touched on ballistics capability, let's get into that. Now, since we already talked about Wikipedia, let's stay on that. There is a 90 grain at 1,025 feet per second. There's a 95 grain Federal FMJ listed at 980. There is a 100 grain Buffalo listed at 1,160. Is going to be with the 9mm. To keep it fair, and I know there's hotter loads in this, but to keep this fair, I looked for a common kind of middle of the road grain weight on Wikipedia to use equal weights and measures, and it lists a Federal 124 grain at 1150. So it is not the same as 9mm Luger. It is not as good a defensive cartridge, in my opinion, and just as far as physics go. That said, it's certainly a proven, capable self-defense caliber. And you have to decide what your threshold is for you. Some people would decide that 9mm is their threshold. Some people would decide that 380 is their threshold. Some will decide that 22 long rifle is their threshold. I'm not here to tell you that my opinion should be your opinion. You decide what the threshold should be for you. On the ballistics performance, there was a time, not that long ago, when I probably would have recommended something you may think is ludicrous, but I may have recommended that you carry full metal jacket in a 380, not in a 9mm, not in a 45, but in a 380, because not that long ago, a lot of those guns had longer barrels, and when these new really, I don't even know what to call them, minuscule compact guns like an LCP, like a P380, like a Bodyguard, had such short barrels, a lot of those really weren't designed to expand out of those barrels anyway. And let's be honest, they weren't known for the most reliability, so why not get around with a round nose and FMJ that probably is going to feed better? And also, the 380 is kind of marginal, so a lot of times if it did expand, it would not penetrate what many would consider deep enough. And what's deep enough? Again, you decide your thresholds. Most people would say 12 inches in ballistics gel. A lot of times, if these rounds, because they are not the most powerful, if they expanded, they wouldn't penetrate deep enough. I don't think that's the case today. There are a lot of really good loads. There has been a giant leap forward, even in the past 20 years, especially in the past 10 years, on ballistics technology. And I know hollow points were around before, but for them to be common and for the average person to have access to really good common hollow point ammunition is not going back that far. I don't believe they became common even in U.S. police service until the mid-80s to early 90s. And the first generations of them had some flaws, especially in 380. But again, I would not recommend that today. There are a lot of really good loads today. Still, you decide what's best for you. I wouldn't advise carrying a full metal jacket in a 9mm or a 45 ACP. But if you still chose to carry FMJ in a 380, I would not call that foolish. You decide. You do your due diligence. But because 380 is still so popular in these really small subcompact guns, you get loads that are designed for really short barrels. You get loads that are designed to kind of straddle that line. And there's an inverse relationship between expansion and penetration. The wider that projectile gets, the more it decreases its ability to penetrate, right? So you got to balance that out. And a lot of ammunition manufacturers, you know, especially the big ones that put in a lot of R&D, have gotten really good at that. And a lot of that technology that went into like law enforcement 9mm loads that made it so good recently also trickled down into the 380. So again, you do your due diligence and choose your load for you. But there are a lot of really good defensive loads for the 380. Spear Gold Dots, Hornady Critical Defense, and many others, right? You do your own research. what shoots point of aim, point of impact for you, what's reliable in your gun. Because again, let's be honest, these super subcompact 380s are not the most reliable handguns. Even my wife's Glock 42, which we bought new from a gun store, does not work well, not well at all with certain kinds of ammunition. And with others, it works quite well. You got to balance that out for you. I've said this many times in many other calibers, but don't be the guy that goes out to the range and trains with ball and then loads up your super subcompact 380 with some uber cool defensive ammunition that you've never run through that gun. Test it in your gun. Does it shoot point of aim, point of impact for you? Is it reliable when fired by you in your gun? That's especially true with these super subcompact 380s. On that, if you are looking for, and I guess you could call this a pre-tactical tip, LAPD has a backup gun qual. Low round count, reasonable ranges. If you're carrying a, what did I call it before? A minuscule compact gun, a really tiny gun like this, and you want a good metrics, a good thing to train on, you may look at the LAPD backup gun qual. I was LAPD, probably know that from listening to the bio multiple times. Not a super hard qual. You may look at that if you're carrying one of these really small guns. Better than just standing there static at, an indoor range, picking your gun up off the table and shooting at whatever cadence you feel like with no timer and being like, that's probably good enough to trust my life to. I'm not saying it's the best minuscule compact gun qual, but I'm telling you there is one and you can run it and at least have a standard and a metrics with which to test yourself. Alright, if you like this episode of Gunfighter Life, and I'm surprised at how well the cartridge talks do, they tend to do quite well. And a lot of times I do weird obscure cartridges, and I realized I hadn't done one yet on the 380, which is not weird or obscure. If you like this content, the more substantial content, I just did one called Don't Get Shot on cover concealment and movement, like what I would consider like a meat and potatoes podcast. If you want to support the content, help other men be better, the prime directive to make godly men strong and strong men godly, I consider that the kind of mission statement of this podcast. You want to support that. You want to support the message. Consider becoming a patron. All right, with that, as a thanks for listening, I'm going to give you another tactical tip. You might think me being a professional podcaster, I'm super savvy on the tech stuff. I am not. Here's a little backstory. When I first got into podcasting, the initial flagship podcast, I still consider the flagship, Simple Man Sermons. I paid a young millennial a certain amount of money, I can't even remember, and I said, here, get this on the internet. And they did. And they showed me what to do to upload it. And as they say, the rest is history. I've learned a lot along the way by God's grace, but I'm not the most tech-savvy person. This is a labor of love. And I recently learned this from my wife, who has a master's degree, super smart, a little bit younger, much more tech-savvy than me. Control-Shift-T. You ever exit out of something and exit out of all your tabs, and you're like, I can't believe I did that. Maybe you know about this. Maybe most people know about this, but I didn't know about this. So I have to deduce that somebody out there in the audience does not know about Control-Shift-T. You hit that and it brings your tabs back up. Awesome. Awesome tactical tip. More important than all the gun content, more important than the tactical tip, the tactical verse of the day. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep His commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. That's New Testament. That's the book of John. Compare that to the words of Jesus Himself. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, Did we not prophesy in your name? Cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Comments. How do you know that you love God? You do what He says. Simple, powerful truth. With that, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.